But yeah, thanks so much, everyone, for coming to our third data ethics workshop for the Australian Data Science Network. Yes, I'll begin with Acknowledgement of Country. QUT acknowledges the Turrbal and Yugara as the First Nation owners of the lands where QUT now stands. We pay respect to their elders, lores, customs, and creation spirits, and we recognize that these lands have always been places of teaching, research, and learning. QUT acknowledges the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders play within the QUT community. Yeah, and so this is today's lineup for the workshop. The exciting thing for me in organizing these is I get to invite all the people I most want to hear speak. So I'm certainly excited for today. We record these sessions so we can share them later on australiandatascience.net as well as on YouTube. And so if you missed the first two, you can find them here, linked to from the ADSN website. And they were, really, really great discussions, great lightning talks and good questions afterwards. I also just wanted to make a little plug for QUT's Center for Data Science is having a Women in Data Science event on Wednesday, June 15th. And you can sign up for that online. And it's, I believe, a hybrid event. So you can participate via Zoom or in person if you're in the Brisbane area. Yeah, and so today's format will be same as our previous two. Oh, sorry, this says 3. It's 4 5-minute lightning talks, and we'll just take 1 or 2 quick questions after each. And if there are more questions, we just save those for our longer Q&A and discussion at the end, which is fun. And the speakers can also respond to each other's talks. And there's been a lot of great synergy with the previous ones, of even when the topics seem different, some kind of common themes emerging. Yeah, and so let's jump into it. Oh, and Tim has put the link in the chat if you want to register for the Women in Data Science event. All right, so our first speaker will be Lachlan Mccalman. Lachlan is Chief Practitioner at the Gradient Institute. He has spent the last decade applying probabilistic machine learning to diverse problem domains for government and industry, including targeted auditing, spatial and spatial temporal prediction, and causal inference. Previously, Lachlan was group leader of inference systems engineering at Cyro's Data 61 and also worked at National ICT Australia. And so you can go ahead, Lachlan.
Thanks very much, Rachel, and thanks everyone for having me today. It's really great to I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I promise I'll talk for less than 5 minutes, so let's get into it. Everyone see my screen okay? All right, this is going to be a really practical 5 minutes. It's going to be just an observation that we've made at Gradient Institute that we think deserves more attention than it's getting. The reason I got into the ethical considerations around AI was because I found myself personally in a team that was building systems for government, and we could see that technical choices we made about how that system was designed wouldn't affect the accuracy measures of that system, but would decide who benefited and who harmed. We had people's lives in our hands. As data scientists with no context around how the system was going to be employed and what the safeguards were, this was not our responsibility. It's not fair on us. And this is what kickstarted my journey in this whole field, was understanding the power that we held in our hands that we didn't want to. Since then, we've been doing a lot of auditing of systems, a lot of working with big companies, and unfortunately, despite now AI ethics being a big deal for them, we have yet to see that particular problem be solved. That's what I want to talk about today. There's a very common way that ethical AI governance is deployed today in big companies, not just finance. Since I wrote the title of this talk, we've encountered at least one tech company that does things this way as well. What it is that there is a separation between technical decisions about how a machine learning system is built and the business decisions about how the actual product powered by that system is used. This creates a silo where the tech team has no idea what the impacts of their choices are and just try and say, oh, well, let's make it within 10%, we'll make it across some standard fairness measures, for example. They don't have the context or the visibility about what is actually being impacted, who the people are and what the consequences are of their technical choices. On the other side, the person who's actually responsible and accountable for this system has no visibility of those decisions and is not able to make informed judgments about when those decisions conflict, when there's conflicting objectives, when different people win and lose from the system. That behavior is already baked into the system when they get hold of it. We feel that this is a big problem because it means that there's a lot of unintended consequences still happening from the system that the designers who are actually building the model can't even see, let alone address. It also removes accountability from the person who's actually the system owner from understanding the choices that they're meant to be making. We believe this needs to be fixed. And one way to think about this is to say, well, the system owner or owners, the existing governance structures exist in organizations. They are in 9 times out of 10 used to doing difficult balancing of different considerations for their systems. But for some reason, AI specifically gets its own track of decision-making, of validation, of metrics, and they're not a part of that. We think that it's important to actually bring the existing governance structure into the model selection process so that the people designing the system can actually understand it's not a question of accuracy rates, it's a question of impacts, understanding the actual human cost of the system. And we want to empower the existing governance structures to be accountable, to make documented decisions about this, about these important technical choices. The challenge is, of course, the translation from technical decision about what form of inference you use, what your missing data approach is, to the actual impact that that has. And there are qualitative and quantitative concerns of that nature. So we've done some sort of prototyping of some approaches to get those decisions into the hands of the people that need to make them and force data scientists to actually go further than just accuracy or fairness bias measures and move to putting those decisions in front of the right people in terms of their human impacts. So there's a little demo that explains a little bit more on the website there, and that's 23 seconds over. So thank you.
No, that was great. Thank you, Lachlan. Yeah, that definitely, many of those themes resonated about, yeah, kind of the way that siloing can create these bad setups where people think somebody else has taken care of it. I was curious if you've seen any org structures that you think help or are kind of particularly useful at getting around that siloing issue, because I feel like it's so common for orgs to be kind of overly siloed.
The key idea is that the product, like, it's very common that there's a notion of a product and that there is even ethical considerations attached to that product. It's just that that product uses some piece of data or software that has been thrown over the fence. The effective thing that we try to argue is that the person who is doing that technical work should be in terms of the governance structure, with the product lead, right? There's not this sense where that is actually a completely different responsibility. And it also, we think, having the product lead be involved in the metrics and qualitative objectives for the system in a way that's actually visible to the tech team is really important as well. So we still get asked what fairness measure to use, and that question is a huge red flag to us because it indicates that there's no connection between what the system's actually doing and what the values of the organization are, and the information that's being given to the tech team.
Yeah, no, thank you. Then I'll also read David Lovell asked a question in the chat. He said, "Fantastic talk, Lachlan. You described ethical issues after the conception and initiation of development of an AI system. Maybe the ethical horse has already bolted by then." So I guess kind of asking about, yeah, I guess like when in the timeline.
It's a really important point. Like one of the necessary kind of preconditions, I suppose, for an approach like this is that you kind of have defined what you want before you start building the model, because if your model validation and your model selection is going to be done against those things. So, I mean, that helps, but I agree that it's not enough. You know, this is not the only thing we need to worry about. Questions of legitimacy of the implementation in the first place, of what is the design space that the data scientists have been given? Is there an approach outside that space that would be better for everyone? Are still questions that you need to build into any kind of design and governance structure. Absolutely.
Great, thank you. So we're gonna move on to Sam's talk now, but we'll have more questions and discussion at the end. And yeah, everyone remember you can ask questions in the chat as well, and also the link from Lachlan's slide for the AI control panel has been shared in the chat.
And just one final thing,
sure.
It may go down. We're not like production team of software developers, so apologies if it's down. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. So yeah, next up, Samantha Floriani is program lead at Digital Rights Watch. Her focus includes the impact of pervasive surveillance, privacy as a collective good, and how content moderation disproportionately harms some groups over others. Previously, she was a privacy and technology specialist with Salinger Privacy, a board member of the Australian Privacy Foundation, and program director for Code Like a Girl. So you can go ahead.
Awesome, thank you. I'm so stoked to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Let me see if I can just get my screen. I'm just going to jump right in. So only recently I finished studying data science. And so today I really want to talk about some of the issues that really plagued me throughout the course of my studies. And those are ideas around data positivism, some of the inherent challenges associated with treating complex humans as a set of data points, and how this can impact our experiences and human rights in the digital age. I do want to emphasize that I'm not here to point fingers at data scientists. And I think actually coming after Lachlan is really interesting because I echo a lot of the sort of concerns raised there about governance structures as well. I'm more interested in sort of posing a couple of ideas and tensions and hopefully provoking some interesting thought and discussions. So one of the ideas that keeps coming up and causing all kinds of issues in our work with Digital Rights Watch is techno-solutionism. So this idea that we can just jump to technological means to solve complex social problems, sort of seeing tech as a solution to everything. And connected to this, and something that I think is particularly relevant for data science, is this idea of data positivism. This belief that the world is knowable and therefore predictable, and all you need is enough data and the right way to process it. And for example, I think this quote from Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, highlights this pretty clearly. And I would note also as a privacy advocate that this line of thinking really incentivizes and justifies collecting more and more data, including personal information. And by tapping into this sort of fantasy of data positivism, it establishes like a moral mandate for us to collect more and more data by more and more intrusive means, in turn impacting our right to privacy and having all kinds of flow-on effects for us living in a surveillance-obsessed world. And interweaved with this is a kind of culture of prediction. And while I think a lot of people would say things like, no prediction is 100% accurate, and caution people against using predictive analytics or outputs from machine learning models as, treating them as gospel, the trouble is that I think in a lot of cases, regardless of whether we should or not, that's not exactly how it plays out in practice. I'm sure to the horror of plenty of data scientists and statisticians who work on these issues. And so in talking with people in the tech policy space, data science is often sort of treated as this pathway towards some kind of like techno-utopian future where everything is understandable and predictable, and governments and private companies alike kind of froth this idea of increasing profit and productivity that comes with that vision. But I really worry about what it means for our experiences as humans, and specifically our cultural diversity. So while studying data science, I became like really fixated about this idea of like definitions and boundaries. And, you know, when tasked with something like wrangling data, like I would really spiral and be like, what does it mean if we group people in this way rather than in another way? And as a queer person, this particularly played on my mind around questions of gender and sexuality. You know, what happens when a data scientist chooses only to have male or female markers, for example? And if you do choose to include more options, what does that mean for the usefulness of your model? And then vitally, you know, what does that mean for the many, many people who don't subscribe to a fixed definition of gender? You know, is there room for this kind of nuance in traditional ideas around data science? And then broader than that, like what are the longer term normative impacts of these kinds of decisions about how we categorize people, given that data science models are becoming increasingly integrated into more and more parts of our lives? And I would just like to emphasize that one of the beautiful parts of being queer or being gender nonconforming, at least to me, is the autonomy to transcend rigid norms about and ideas around gender and sexuality, and to have the freedom to kind of move between categories and occupy like a liminal space. So how do you standardize that? How do you normalize that when it's by its very nature something that rejects standardization? And should you even try to? So when our technological systems reinforce normative ideas of gender and sexuality, or across other complex areas like race, they often reinforce this idea of what people should be, usually subscribing to the status quo or reinforcing existing power dynamics. And so trans activist Dean Spade uses the term administrative violence to refer to ways that systems create narrow categories of gender and force people into them in order to get their basic needs met. And this plays out in legal systems, of course, but as data science becomes, you know, more and more applied across all kinds of areas, the decisions that are made about how to group people do have very real world impacts on how we're able to, you know, live our lives and exercise our rights. And so the final idea I want to leave you with, and I'm pushing the time boundaries here, is this idea of the gardener's vision. So political scientist Neil Rennick describes the gardener's vision of warfare, in which, you know, the stronger party loses the basic recognition that those we fight follow moral agents. And researcher Oz Keys, who I've got a quote here on the slide, relates this specifically to data science, highlighting how when we lose sight of the humans behind the data, it becomes easy to take on a gardener's vision, to see the process of interacting with it as one of control, wrangling, manipulation, organization. So pruning the garden, if you will. And so I guess really this is just a very brief love letter to the glorious, messy, fluid and unquantifiable garden of life and queerness specifically, and sort of a lament for the ways that this does raise tensions and conflict with many practices in data science, and how the flow-on effects can shape our lives in ways that we may not choose for ourselves. I'm not really sure if there's like an easy solution to any of this, but what I would say is that it's always essential that we try to not lose sight of the humans behind the data, and keep in mind that decisions made about categorizing or grouping or modeling have very real world impacts on people's rights and experiences in both the physical and the digital world. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. That was great. Yeah, and that raised a lot of important issues on this problem of categorizing and trying to put these rigid boundaries on people. I have a question about kind of a tension I hear a lot is between, I guess, the need to have some sort of record of gender or race to try to see if discrimination is happening or measure different treatment. But then, as you pointed out, kind of all these problems that occur when we are trying to categorize gender. And just kind of, I don't know if you have thoughts on kind of navigating that tension of how can you, see if discrimination is happening, but also kind of avoid the pitfalls of narrow categories.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing to raise and a really tricky one, because I feel like if you were to, for example, just be like, well, we won't collect any gender data, for example. We'll just remove that completely. I think then you run into trouble as well about being like, well, are we just erasing the differences? Because there are differences of experiences, right? And like when it comes to, you know, things like medical treatments or whatever, like you run into all sorts of trouble if you are, especially if that means that you end up applying like a standard sort of male by default line of thinking. So yeah, like I think that raises really challenging issues, and I would definitely not be someone who would advocate for not collecting and processing data around gender and race and sexuality necessarily. I think it's so context dependent and so dependent on what the purpose is that you're, you know, what you're trying to do with that information.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, context and purpose. Yeah, I know are huge. And then I see Bernadette has her hand up if you want to ask a question.
Yes, thank you very much, Sam. Thanks, Rachel. I think that was a great talk, and I think it's an incredibly important point. However, I want to offer a little perspective from a historical perspective, and that is that the early web pioneers were all about building community and supporting, in many cases, marginalized communities. That's what some of the earliest billboards were used for in places like San Francisco, where I lived at the time. And so we have to be careful to differentiate between the very capitalist, profit-driven, data capitalist, for lack of a better word, like Eric Schmidt, and not lump all data scientists in with that category, because the people who have been working for 20 or more years on knowledge representation are some of the most altruistic, caring people who wanted to make the web a place of write once, run anywhere, and social equality, and are now, including Tim Berners-Lee, behind the World Wide Web Foundation, and have been for decades, for that matter. So we just have to be careful that the data scientists, some of them have experienced a great tension in their lives that they work for, because they've been lured into places like Facebook and Google, et cetera, and not forget the history of the web and knowledge representation. And many of the people working in that space are very altruistic and want to return information platforms to the area of public good and preserving public goods. But you know, it's two sides of the coin. But super important about the data that is available is predominantly of white, English, often male participants.
Yeah, and I mean, just to clarify, I definitely would not lump all data scientists into one, you know, big monolithic mass. I definitely hear what you're saying. That was not my intention to you know, to come across as though
it's quite all right, but it's just, I think there's a good place for a book, which actually I'm working on, around the history of data, and sort of some of the motivators in some of the areas where we and governments in particular have acquiesced to the information platform companies and the models that Shoshana Zuboff writes magnificently about.
I would add, I think that there is probably also an issue in terms of, you know, the way that things get funding, or the ways that things are commercialized. Like there is an incentive there to be able to make XYZ prediction, be able to have whatever outcome, and meet the sort of like commercial needs, which I think can create extra challenges for people who work in this space. If you have to, you know, if you have to meet those requirements, you're kind of stuck in a terrible position, really.
Yeah, I agree with that about the kind of misaligned incentives that kind of often I think can end up co-opting even kind of good intentions when you're kind of in these systems that kind of aren't well set up for them. In the interest of time, we need to move on to Jake's talk, although there's a lot of great discussion happening in the chat as well. Again, thanks so much, Sam, and we'll return to this in the discussion. But Jake Goldenfein is up next. He's a senior lecturer at Melbourne Law School and an associate investigator in the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making in Society. He is a law and technology scholar studying platform regulation, data governance, surveillance, and legal theory. So you can go ahead, Jake.
Hi, thank you so much. Firstly, thanks so much to Rachel for inviting me. I really appreciate it. This is such a good forum. And thanks to the other panelists, some of whom I'm meeting for the first time, but some who I've known for a long time and whose work I've always enjoyed. Okay, after these really terrific talks, I recognize that what I'm about to talk to you about might both be a little bit narrow and a little bit broad. But, you know, I've seen in the chat that some people are interested in questions of perhaps economics and political economy. And so maybe there's something that you'll take out of it. But let's do our best. Okay, so this work comes out of a series of projects looking at how law attends to the data economy. And in particular, this kind of old refrain that we hear again and again, that technology moves too fast for law. There's this kind of imagination that a technology is developed and then the researchers look at it, they try and identify the harms, there's a slow policy process, and finally there's like a new law that addresses those harms, but oh no, here's a new technology that's already surpassed all that work. So, you know, regulation is perpetually behind. And in reality, this is a very poor account of the relationship between law and technology. And I'll talk a little bit more about why at the end. But I will say that one of the things that drives this, this intuition about law lagging behind technology is that there are some fundamental mismatches that make the way that law attends to certain kinds of technology very awkward. One of the things is, for instance, how law imagines what the data economy is at all, what the elements of the data economy are. So law has its own idea about what a human is, about what decision-making is, about what firms are and how they look, about what data is. It has its own ideas about what markets are. And these are all premised in certain systems of philosophical and economic and political thinking that rose to ascendance and became prominent for a whole variety of historical reasons that I can't get into in 5 minutes. Although the last time I did this talk, it was 45 minutes, so got into that. And if anyone's interested, I'm very happy to send the paper over on which this work is based. So law has its particular imagination of all these things, but the data economy also has its own imagination of these things. You know, what's a human, what's data, what's a firm, what's decision-making, that's premised in a very different system of philosophical and economic thinking, and a product of its own very historical forces. So with some others, I've been working on thinking about how to identify some of these differences. What's the the differences between how law conceptualizes humans and economies, and how data science conceptualizes human and economies in different domains. Recently, and with respect to this work, I've been thinking about that in the context of consumer privacy laws broadly and the online behavioral advertising industry. Because in the face of all this research about how platforms construct choice architectures, how they steer users and manage consumer behavior, etc., I'm constantly sort of asking, you know, isn't it very strange that we have this legal regime that entitles like a rational market participant to sell to a platform the right to exploit all their irrationality, right? Because what we effectively have now is a legal regime that insists on a particular kind of rational actor to construct a system of regulation that requires that actor to effectively make a rational decision to enable them to have their consumer behavior managed computationally. And in certain respects, and some people might say, to have their irrational behavior exploited for profit. So we started this research by tracking different imaginations of the human in different legal regimes used to govern data flows. So in the very basic sort of notice and choice regimes that are really the primary instrument for governing data flow in these kinds of commercial areas, there's this big historical relationship to what's called rational choice liberalism, which was a sort of post-Cold War paradigm that was, part of a political response to Soviet endeavors of socialist planning, and instead a sort of different way to coordinate society. But it has this very particular imagination of what a human agent is, how what their preferences are, these sort of formally stable and transitive preferences, and how they act towards towards maximizing their own utility. In these kinds of legal regimes, the problem of this data market is information asymmetry and market failure caused by information asymmetry. So the solution is transparency, right? We also have sort of data protection regimes or data protection laws. In the advertising context, these are also notice and choice, but regimes that are supplemented with what are called data subject rights. These are what we might call dignitarian rights, rights concerned with representation, and they give individuals a right to have some say, some control over how they're represented in a database by a third party, for instance. Effectively to have some say over their own identity and to have some control to correct how a platform might misconstrue them. We also look at some of the emerging ideas in consumer protection law that seem to actually be responding to the problems of, exploitation of irrationality a little bit more directly. Consumer protection law is very much based on this idea of a reasonable human, and that is increasingly a rational human, but one that's understood as boundedly rational and therefore subject to various cognitive biases and heuristics. And we've seen some cases where the law judges have accepted evidence from behavioral economists to describe the behavior of platform users. So the goal in consumer protection law here is to prevent individuals from being tricked, right? To stop them from making market decisions that they otherwise wouldn't have made. Now, on the other side of the story, we have the advertising industry's own understanding of what a human is, right? And this is itself very two-faced, right? It's certainly not homogeneous, because to regulators, advertisers will portray themselves as trusted advisors of humans, right? No interest or ability to manipulate decisions, no interest on steering sovereign consumers. Advertising industry is simply equipping consumers with the information they need to make their own rational decisions. But to ad buyers, they sell a very different story, right? Consumers on that side are irrational, inept, emotional. They can be steered towards any action or idea. And in the platform era, this is very much premised on decision-making ideas that are drawn from mid-20th century disciplines like operations research and management sciences. And what we have in these contemporary regimes is human decision-making formatted in terms of behavioral probabilities and effectively quantitative units of economic value. So we have this weird mismatch where we have this sort of series of strange economic laws for an imagination of a human. And then they sign a terms of service agreement and become a platform user and effectively governed by a whole different system of regulations that imagine them completely differently, right? And they're translated from a human into a user, which is effectively a resource to be mined for data and attention. So what's going on here, right? Is this a contradiction? Policy people being duped? Is this just the tenacity of old Enlightenment ideas that just won't go away despite new scientifically provable accounts of human agency? It's quite complicated, of course, but we think that the best way to think about this is as not like law trying to catch up to the data economy. This is law producing the data economy, okay? So we have to think about it, rather than catching up, law's generating a data market, and it uses the human as an X variable to enable a particular market formation. So an imagination of what a human is, how they make decisions, what they can do, their behavioral cognitive biases, these are all legal technologies used to stabilize a rational and irrational human into a single entity that legitimizes a particular advertising market premised on the capacity for individuals to express their preferences, while simultaneously preserving an industry built on the computational management of human behavior. So I realize that's a complex place to stop, but hopefully we get a chance to talk about it in some of the discussion. I hope that was interesting to some of you.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you, Jake. I found that, yeah, that helpful to hear these different imaginings. And this, I wanted to ask, do you have kind of what you think a more ideal imagining would be, or like what the, I guess, maybe healthiest way for us to see these relationships as?
So I think the point is that however we contrive or formalize a human, there are political stakes, right? So for instance, you know, the political stakes behind the very sort of stylized account of human decision-making in rational choice liberalism was really in service of a very broad political project. There's some really amazing political theorist scholars like Sonia Amadei who have written about the history of these kinds of forms of economic modeling that get taken up in law about what a human is and the politics that they're connected to. So sort of the history of public choice theory, social choice theory. Who are the economists building these models and why? A lot of it's connected to the Rand Corporation. A lot of it's connected to sort of Cold War thinking. A lot of it's part of what we might call sort of a neoliberal turn in governance. And I think that, you know, even, you know, these sort of behaviorally informed economic models that became very prominent after, you know, Richard Thaler's work and everything like that, they're still performing a certain market function, right? They're still recuperating a particular market actor to preserve a market formation and a system of social relations that define a user in one way, that enables them to legitimize their own sort of exploitation of attention and data. So you know, we can look to the psychologists for a more ideal account of what a human is, but this is still just an approximation, you know. So we're more interested in the ones that actually get put to work and why. And data science is increasingly accommodating more complex models of human behavior, for instance, in reinforcement learning systems, where start looking at like like suboptimal behavior and things like that. And I think they're all really fascinating and have really interesting ethical stakes associated with.
Great, thank you. And we'll have more discussion at the end. Next up is Phan. Thao is a research fellow for the Monash node of the ARC Center of Excellence on Automated Decision-Making in Society. She specializes in the study of gender and race in algorithmic culture. She has researched and published on topics including the aesthetics of digital voice assistants like Siri, Amazon Echo, and Google Home, ideologies of post-race and algorithmic culture, and AI in popular culture. And you can go ahead now.
Thanks very much, Rachel. I don't have slides to share. I'm just going lo-fi today. So thank you to all the other wonderful speakers and for everyone for tuning in. I'll start by just acknowledging that I'm calling to you today from unceded Wurundjeri country, people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. So my talk today is titled Economies of Virtue and is based on a collaborative piece written by myself, Jake Goldenfein, who you just heard from, Monique Mann at Deakin University, and Declan Cush, who's at Western Sydney University. And together we've been reflecting on AI ethics, less in terms of things like broad principles, frameworks, standards for doing ethical AI, and more in terms of the specific structures and agendas that shape conditions of labour for people who are engaged in this work. So people like us, scholars and advocates for civil society who are invested in critical questions around how AI is put to work in everyday life. There's been a real boom in the field of AI ethics over the last few years, which in large part has been a response to what has been broadly characterized as big tech's ethics problem. From algorithmic systems that deliver biased and inequitable outcomes to toxic workplace cultures that exploit workers and discriminate along racist, sexist, and ableist lines. The translation of these crises into problems which can and should be solved through ethical practice has seen an emergent marketplace of skills, signals, and knowledge we term an economy of virtue. In this economy, it's virtue and ethics that are the primary objects that are produced and circulated by groups like big tech. Through the establishment of, for example, ethics boards and working groups, and also outside from universities, research institutes, consultancies, and other allied industries. The logic that a demand for ethics can be met with a complementary supply is shaping not only what ethics is and what it can do, but the labor of those who are said to produce it. In this way, big tech has transformed ethics into a standardized commodity, a transactional object external to the organization, one of the many things contemporary capitalists must tame and procure. At the heart of our critique is the acknowledgement that our own fields of practice have contributed to shaping the current landscape and to sustaining this economy of virtue. While social studies of science and technology scholars have often been the first to diagnose the ethical problems of big tech, we've also been some of the first to proffer solutions and to capitalize upon what Lee Winsell calls a critique hype, that is, critical responses that actively participate in or inflate new tech hype. This is unsurprising considering the growing expectation that university workers participate in generating industrial outputs, but it also exposes researchers to the whims of competing industrial agendas that, at best, compromises the work we do by narrowing the field of practice, and at worst makes us complicit with systems and actors that seek to operationalize ethics in order to protect their own self-interests. Ours is, of course, not the only field to be co-opted in this way. Mohammed Abdallah and Mustafa Abdallah have written a blistering critique comparing the strategies used by big tech to the strategies used by big tobacco to sway and influence academic and public discourse, and the effect this has in academia from the institutional level down to individual researchers. There's also been comparisons to bioethics and its history too in holding medical research and big pharma to account, to a situation now in which many bioethicists are hired by medical schools and by big pharma to provide ethical consultancy. All of this is of course happening in the context of a rapidly declining funding for universities in Australia and globally, in which participating in an economy of virtue that is producing and exchanging ethics as a commodity is really the main strategy for survival within an increasingly precarious industry. With this in mind, I think the main question that many of us need to pause and consider is, who does AI ethics serve today? Who is funding the research? Who is driving the agendas? I'm not advocating for a purity politics or some kind of nostalgic view of the good old days when this didn't happen, but I think the way that universities are being managed means that many of us are being encouraged to be consultants for industry, whether we're conscious of it or not. And if there's one thing we know, it's that industry is not always earnest when they ask us to hold them to account. There are still some questions that can't be asked there, but they need to be asked somewhere, and that somewhere is rapidly diminishing. Thank you very much. I'll just leave it there.
Oh, thank you, Thao. Yeah, that was very powerful. I think that, yeah, that this issue of kind of co-option is huge. And yeah, particularly kind of how that dovetails with this decline in university funding. I guess, do you have any, personal advice for kind of how we as data scientists or researchers can, reckon with this?
I don't know if I do. I mean, the main thing that I have is, I think what we have here is this, what I'm named, it really is an open secret. I don't think this is something that, I think everyone would have their own anecdotes about having to navigate this kind of situation. But I think it's important to have forums like this where we can start to talk about it aloud and start to name the problem and start to name when we situate ourselves in it. Because I said this at the end there, but I'm not advocating for a purity politics. Like all of us are in sort of messy and difficult situations, and if it comes between a choice between like getting paid and like paying your mortgage and feeding your family or like taking money from somewhere, people will always choose to like safety for themselves and the ones that they love. But there is a point around where we start to perpetuate the very conditions with which we're trying to, work back against. So sort of the more we say, the more of us that say yes to particular types of funding, the more of us that sort of, validate a particular form of funding model, the more that thing gets perpetuated,
Right.
So I'm just thinking, for instance, of sort of ARC funding that is like, discovery projects are being like massively diminished, but industry linkages are being massively sort of like expanded. And there are just some questions you can't ask with a linkage, with an industry linkage, that you can ask in, say, a discovery.
Yeah, no, thank you. I agree. Just even being able to name and discuss it is important. Now I want to give some time for the panelists to respond to each other. Sorry, by panelists, I mean speakers. But yeah, if any of you kind of have reactions to each other's talks or questions, we'll spend a few minutes on that now. And those were 4 fantastic talks. So thank you all again.
I mean, I can kick us off by just saying that I think there's lots of interesting themes around, I suppose, tensions. The tensions particularly in Sam's talk around commercial incentives to make sort of queer life legible. I mean, there's sort of like political incentives to make queer life legible, but there are also commercial incentives to do that too now, right? Like if we could have like, if there could be perfect personalization in regards to gender, like if everyone could have the perfect button that they push that perfectly represented who they were, like a corporation would fucking love that, because it'd be like, yes, great, what a unique and wonderful data point that you've helped to identify for us. And so there's an interesting point of tension there between sort of like the co-option capture of queer life, which I think is like, not unlike the kind of tensions between the co-option capture of people who want to do good with ethics and AI and like AI and social responsibility.
I'm not sure it would be like a great outcome if we were able to perfectly capture gender. Can you imagine? What a nightmare. Like it feels...
Yeah, but you wouldn't be surprised if Google came out with like, here is a big spectrum and you just like, here's a big color spectrum and you just like, what is your gender, and you just had to pinpoint it there, and that would be like perfect market information for them.
Yeah, interesting. My reflections, I mean, I at the risk of just kind of ping-ponging off each other, I really resonated with this idea of ethics as a commodity, and I feel like it comes up a lot in the kinds of things that we work on in Digital Rights Watch, like people seeking like to be ethical as like an endpoint, being like, let's tick this ethical box, let's get it done so that we can then like essentially sell whatever it is that we're doing, and in the process of that only reinforcing a lot of the sort of harmful stuff that is embedded in it. So I guess my immediate reflection is that really struck home with me in some of the work that we do in civil society, for sure.
Maybe I'll jump in on the sort of access to the gender attribute tag. Like from a more practitioner's perspective, a lot of the people that we work, like gender's an interesting edge case in some sense, because it's kind of like plausibly available in some circumstances, but there are a lot of really important and even legally binding discrimination attributes that will never be that most people will never have access to, and probably can't predict either. And a lot of organizations are really grappling with and unsure what to do about this. You can't solve it by prediction. Predicting someone's religion or their like disability status or something like that is, there's simply not the ground truth to even approach a question like that, but they're legally required to prevent discrimination in some circumstances with respect to that. And this is, tying in from on the law side, I think some of those questions around, well, if we're not using the attribute, direct discrimination is kind of like not obviously applicable, but then the questions around indirect discrimination are still very much alive. And there's a tremendous amount of like, help us please out there of what, well-meaning teams, but that it's pretty clear to us that approaching the problem of like discrimination with respect to these attributes that you'll never measure is like a design problem about what kind of thing like that needs to happen before you're starting to do statistics across the performance of your model. So I guess, you know, there's anyone who has thoughts about like how to tackle the question of designing a system to discriminate in the case where you can't measure the attribute, we suggest go and talk to those people and find out what their pain points are for the system and understand their unique case and build your system to address those points is kind of our approach. But like, it's often that, you know, that's a big ask to do for a lot of orgs. Not that that justifies not doing it.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you, Lachlan. I want to echo something, and Sam said this earlier, but just to kind of remind everyone also that even if you're not collecting information on race or sexuality or religion, machine learning models find latent variables. And so you can still be discriminating on those factors because, I mean, that's kind of what machine learning does, is kind of find differences to kind of categorize differences, which can be good or bad depending on the context. And so that, not recording this information doesn't mean that you're not acting on it or treating different groups differently. There's another comment, I think I feel this way as well, that this helped give words and vocabularies to a lot of kind of fuzzy intuitions. And I would second that comment from Ghana. David has a question. Does this discussion point us away from the use of ML or AI in high stakes or high consequences decisions? And if so, what do you think is a better alternative?
This is a very complicated question. And there's a lot of work being done on how to govern the use of ML in high stakes situations precisely. One of the other things I suggested I could maybe talk about at this workshop is sort of this fallback reliance on the idea of a human in the loop as a governance mechanism for the use of ML in high stakes situations, which I think, I mean, as you might have gathered from my talk, I'm very interested in this question of how we imagine humans and what they can do, specifically in that relationship to these kinds of decision systems. And I think that there seems to be this fantasy that, like, by having a human who's fundamentally accountable and responsible for high stakes decisions, that's going to solve all your problems. But I'm going to tell you that your imagining of a human there is probably also a bit problematic, or has been contrived for a particular purpose that perhaps an actual real life human can't fulfill. So, I mean, that's a very quick response, and one that pushes us to think in another direction. But, maybe I'll get invited back to talk again about something else.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to Jake, I mean, this is an interesting conundrum because, like, the reason we have AI ML decisions in particular high stakes contexts is because of the failures of humans to begin with. And so, there was sort of this human in the loop question is super interesting, like genealogically, because it's just like, well, these humans are fucking up. What do we do? Well, we have to automate and sort of like use objective measures in some way. And it's like, oh God, they're terrible too. Like, get that human back into the loop. So I don't know if there's an easy answer to that at all. Yeah.
Right, and then I see that Ben Harrop has his hand up. If you want to ask a question.
So, just a brief bit of context. I'm doing research on the child protection system and how it relates to Indigenous children and their health. So the data I'm working with is administrative data that wasn't collected for research purposes. And I'm really interested to hear some thoughts from the panel on how, I guess, these settler colonial organizations like the Department of Child Protection, they obviously collect data for their own internal operations, but the way that they abstract people's lives is through that settler colonial, I guess, perspective. And not only how do you sort of work with the biases inherent in administrative data that wasn't collected for research purposes, but also factoring in that lens which is used in creating those data sets? It's just something I'm thinking a lot about, and I'd be interested to hear what people have to say.
I'll say that's a good question, Ben. I think something we're running into is I think this this panel for me raised a lot of really important issues, and also I think gave many of us kind of a language to better articulate some of these issues. But I think there is still a lot of difficulty when kind of putting into practice. Then kind of how do you navigate this in practice? So this. I'll say I think it's good that you're thinking about this. But yeah, I don't know that there's a clear answer.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for asking the question, Ben. I think a lot of us are hesitant because I suppose child protections itself is like considered perhaps the most colonial institution of all the settler colonial institutions, and has been probably arguably one of the most active in like obliterating Indigenous culture and life. And so the use of any interoperable data set within that context is really difficult to comment upon, because of that. And I suppose I would just point to say that there is lots of great work around data sovereignty that might be useful for you in terms of ethically navigating that terrain. But yeah, it's difficult to offer a commentary on something like that when all of us are settlers, really, as well.
I mean, my intuition is very similar. There are better ways to imagine how to govern, manage, produce, and operationalize data than current government organizations use. But that doesn't mean we should be like abolitionists in terms of data collection about society. We have, 20+ million people in Australia that need food, housing, and all sorts of various things to survive. And we need data and decision making to feed and clothe and educate all these people. And so, yeah, it's a matter of like finding mechanisms to do that don't reproduce the same sorts of settler violence that have been happening and continue to happen for such a long time.
Yeah, just the settler violence of the child protection system, I think, goes beyond the scope of just data collection and data management, such that even if you found a good way to do what you're asking, it wouldn't necessarily make for a better process.
Okay, I see David has his hand up, so David can comment, and this may be our final comment because we are almost at time. But go ahead, David.
Okay, my final comment is to say thanks to the panelists for such thought-provoking responses, and to say that I feel that we've arrived at the point where we're starting to name the fundamental tensions that are at play here. The desire to have things that treat individuals well, but to do so on a massive sort of public scale. The need to have sound decision making to help with managing important resources and things like that. And I don't believe that we can end this session with easy answers to almost all of these things, but I do think that where we've arrived at here, where we're sort of saying, hey, look, these things are fundamentally in tension, is a great place to reach at the end of this. So again, many thanks to the panelists and to you, Rachel, for another fabulous session.
Yeah, I'll just echo the thanks to the panelists. Those were all very thought-provoking talks, and helpful for me. And also, judging from the discussion in the chat, I think a lot of people here today found these really helpful and thought-provoking. So I just want to thank everyone who's participated and everyone who's here. Thank you, and we'll see you at future ones. And again, you can see the videos from the past two available online. And hopefully we'll all continue these discussions and these reflections in our work. Thank you.